Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Chapters Live. As always, I'm Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, I have on my fabulous wizard's hat, and we are going to dive once again into Twain's classic novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Now, to fill you in on what happened the last time, we concluded our quest with Hank and Sandy as they strove to find the maidens trapped in a castle with an ogre. And we did locate it, except that the castle turned out to be a shack, and the ogre turned out to be a sheep herder, and the ladies, the captive ladies, all turned out to be pigs. So, in fact, this great quest was simply to rescue a group of pigs. But it was on our way back that we met our next adventure, which was we stopped at a holy spring where the water had suddenly dried up. Well, Hank, being a modern man, was quick to see that the well had just sprung a leak and was able to fix it, but he did so with great magic and sorcery, with gunpowder and explosives to make everyone still think that he was a magician of sorts, and also to once again humiliate the crap out of Merlin. So, where we will pick up is right on the heels of that fantastic adventure, and it is with Chapter 24, A Rival Magician. My influence in the Valley of Holiness was something prodigious now. It seemed worthwhile to try to turn it to some valuable account. The thought came to me the next morning and was suggested by my seeing one of my knights who was in the soap line come riding in. According to history, the monks of this place 2 centuries before had been worldly minded enough to want to wash. It might be that there was a leaven of this unwant to wash, leaven of this unrighteousness still remaining. So I sounded a brother. Wouldn't you like a bath? He shuddered at the thought of the peril of it to the well, but he said with feeling, One needs not to ask that of a poor body who has not known that blessed refreshment sith that he was a boy. Would God I might wash me, but it may not be, fair sir, tempt me not. It is forbidden. And he sighed in such a sorrowful way that I was resolved he should have at least one layer of his real estate removed, if it sized up my whole influence and bankrupted the pile. So I went to the abbot and asked for a permit for this brother. He blenched at the idea. I don't mean that you could see him blench, for of course you couldn't see it without you scraped him, and I didn't care enough about it to scrape him. But I knew the blench was there, just the same, and within a book cover's thickness of the surface, too. Blenched and trembled, he said, Ah, son, ask aught else thou wilt, and it is thine, and freely granted out of a grateful heart. But this, oh this, would you drive away the blessed water again? No, father, I will not drive it away. I have mysterious knowledge, which teaches me that there was an error that other time when it thought the institution of the bath banished the fountain. A large interest began to show up in the old man's face. My knowledge informs me that the bath was innocent of that misfortune, which was caused by quite another sort of sin. These are brave words, but right welcome if they be true. They are true indeed. Let me build the bath again, father. Let me build it again, and the fountain shall flow forever. You promise this. You promise it? Say the word. Say you promise it. I do promise it. Then will I have the first bath myself. Go, get ye to your work. Tarry not, but go. I and me and my boys were at work straight off. The ruins of the old bath were there yet, in the basement of the monastery, not a stone missing. They had been left just so all these lifetimes and avoided with a pious fear, as things accursed. In 2 days we had it all done and the water in, a spacious pool of clear, pure water that a body could swim in. It was running water, too. It came in and went out through the ancient pipes. The old abbot kept his word and was the first to try it. He went down black and shaky, leaving the whole black community above troubled and worried and full of bodings. But he came back white and joyful, and the game was made. Another triumph scored. It was a good campaign that we made in that Valley of Holiness, and I was very well satisfied and ready to move on now, but I struck a disappointment. I caught a heavy cold, and it started up an old looking rheumatism of mine. Of course, the rheumatism hunted up my weakest place and located itself there. This was the place where the abbot put his arms about me and mashed me, what time he was moved to testify his gratitude to me with an embrace. When at last I got out, I was a shadow. But everybody was full of attentions and kindnesses, and these brought cheer back into my life and were the right medicine to help a convalescent swiftly up toward health and strength again. So I gained fast. Sandy was worn out with nursing, so I made up my mind to turn out and go a cruise alone, leaving her at the nunnery to rest up. My idea was to disguise myself as a free man of peasant degree and wander through the country a week or two on foot. This would give me a chance to eat and lodge with the lowliest and poorest class of free citizens on equal terms. There was no other way to inform myself perfectly of their everyday life and the operations of the laws upon it. If I went among them as a gentleman, there would be restraints and conventionalities which would shut me out from their private joys and troubles, and I should get no further than the outside shell. One morning I was out on a long walk to get up muscle for my trip and had climbed the ridge which bordered the northern extremity of the valley, when I came upon an artificial opening in the face of a low precipice, and recognized it by its location as a hermitage which had often been pointed out to me from a distance, as the den of a hermit of high renown for dirt and austerity. I knew he had lately been offered a situation in the Great Sahara, where lions and sandflies made the hermit life peculiarly attractive and difficult, and had gone to Africa to take possession, so I thought I would look in and see how the atmosphere of this den agreed with its reputation. My surprise was great. The place was newly swept and scoured. Then there was another surprise. Back in the gloom of the cavern, I heard the clink of a little bell, and then this exclamation: "Hello, Central! Is this you, Camelot? Behold, thou mayest be glad thy heart, and thou hast faith to believe the wonderful, when it cometh in unexpected guise, and maketh itself manifest in impossible places. Here standeth in the flesh his mightiness the boss, and with thine own ears shall ye hear him speak." Now what a radical reversal of things this was. What a jumbling together of extravagant incongruities. What a fantastic conjunction of opposites and irreconcilables. The home of the bogus miracle became the home of a real one. The den of a medieval hermit turned into a telephone office. The telephone clerk stepped into the light, and I recognized one of my young fellows. I said, "How long has this office been established here, Ulphus?" "But since midnight, fair Sir Boss, and it please you. We saw many lights in the valley, and so judged it well to make a station. For that where so many lights be, needs must they indicate a town of goodly size." "Quite right. It isn't a town in the customary sense, but it's good stand anyway. Do you know where you are?" "Of that I've had no time to make inquiry, for when as my comradeship moved hence upon their labors, leaving me in charge, I got me to needed rest, purposing to inquire when I waked, and report the place's name to Camelot for record. Well, this is the Valley of Holiness." It didn't take. He didn't start at the name as I supposed he would. He merely said, "I will so report it." "Why, the surrounding regions are filled with the noise of late wonders that have happened here. You didn't hear of them?" "Ah, ye will remember we move by night and avoid speech with all. We learn naught but that we get by the telephone from Camelot." "Why, they know all about this thing. Haven't they told you anything about the great miracle of the restoration of a holy fountain?" "Oh, that! Indeed, yes, but the name of this valley doth woundily differ from the name of that one. Indeed, to differ widely were not possible." "What was that name, then?" "The Valley of Hellishness." "That explains it. Confound a telephone anyway. It is the very demon for conveying similarities of sound that are miracles of divergence from similarity of sense. But no matter, you know the name of the place now. Call up Camelot." He did it and had Clarence sent for. It was good to hear my boy's voice again. It was like being home. After some affectionate interchanges and some account of my late illness, I said, "What is new?" "The king and queen and many of the court do start even in this hour to go to your valley to pay pious homage to the waters ye have restored, and cleanse themselves of sin, and see the place where the infernal spirit spouted true hell flames to the cloud. And ye listen sharply, ye may hear me wink, and hear me likewise smile a smile. 'Twas I that made selection of those flames from out our stock, and sent them by your order." "Does the king know the way to this place?" "The king? No, nor to any other in his realms mayhap, but the lads that help you with your miracle will be his guides and lead the way, and appoint the places for rests at noons and sleeps at night. This will bring them here when? Mid-afternoon or later the third day. Anything else in the way of news?" "The king hath begun the raising of the standing army ye suggested to him. One regiment is complete and officered." "The mischief! I wanted a Manhattan that myself. There's only one body of men in the kingdom that are fitted to officer a regular army." "Yes, and now you will marvel to know there's not so much as one West Pointer in that regiment." "What are you talking about? Are you in earnest?" "It is truly as I have said." "Now this makes me uneasy. Who were chosen, and what was the method? Competitive examination? Indeed, I know not of the method. I but know this. These officers be all of noble family, and are born, what is it you call them? Chuckleheads. There's something wrong, Clarence. Comfort yourself, then, for 2 candidates for a lieutenancy do travel hence with the king, young nobles both, and if you but wait where you are, you will hear them questioned. Do but note that is news to the purpose. I will get 1 West Pointer in anyway. Mount a man and send him to that school with a message. Let him kill horses if necessary, but he must be there before sunset tonight, and say, there is no need. I have laid a ground wire to the school. Prithee, let me connect you with it. It sounded good. In this atmosphere of telephones and lightning communication with distant regions, I was breathing the breath of life again after long suffocation. I realized then what a creepy, dull, inanimate horror this land had been to me all these years, and how I had been in such a stifled condition of mind as to have grown used to it almost beyond the power to notice it. I gave my order to the superintendent of the academy personally. I also asked him to bring me some paper and a fountain pen and a box or so of safety matches. I was getting tired of doing without these conveniences. I could have them now, as I wasn't going to wear armor any more at present, and therefore could get at my pockets. When I got back to the monastery, I found a thing of interest going on. The abbot and his monks were assembled in the great hall, observing with childish wonder and faith the performances of a new magician, a fresh arrival. His dress was the extreme of the fantastic, as showy and foolish as the sort of thing an Indian medicine man wears. He was mowing and mumbling and gesticulating and drawing mystical figures in the air and on the floor. The regular thing, you know. He was a celebrity from Asia, so he said, and that was enough. That sort of evidence was as good as gold and passed current everywhere. How easy and cheap it was to be a great magician on this fellow's terms. His speciality was to tell you what any individual on the face of the globe was doing at the moment, and what he had done at any time in the past, and what he would do at any time in the future. He asked if any would like to know what the Emperor of the East was doing now. The sparkling eyes and the delighted rubbing of hands made eloquent answer. This reverend crowd would like to know what that monarch was at, just at this moment. The fraud went through some more mummery, and then made grave announcement, the high and mighty Emperor of the East doth at this moment put money in the palm of a holy begging friar, 1, 2, 3 pieces, and they be all of silver. A buzz of admiring exclamations broke out all around. It's marvelous, wonderful. What study, what labor to have acquired so amazing power as this. Would they like to know what the Supreme Lord of India was doing? Yes. He told them what the Supreme Lord of India was doing. And he told them what the Sultan of Egypt was at. Also what the King of the Remote Seas was about. And so on and so on. And with each new marvel, the astonishment at his accuracy rose higher and higher. They thought he must surely strike an uncertain place sometime. But no, he never had to hesitate. He always knew, and always with unerring precision. I saw that if this thing went on, I should lose my supremacy. This fellow would capture my following. I should be left out in the cold. I must put a cog in his wheel and do it right away, too. I said, if I might ask, I should very greatly like to know what a certain person is doing. Speak, and freely I will tell you. It will be difficult, perhaps impossible. My art knoweth not that word. The more impossible it is, the more certainly will I reveal it to you. You see, it was working up the interest. It was getting high, too. You could see that by the craning necks all around and the half-suspended breathing. So now I climaxed it. If you will make no mistake, if you tell me truly what I want to know, I will give you 200 silver pennies. The fortune is mine. I will tell you what you would know. Then tell me what I am doing with my right hand. Ah! There was a general gasp of surprise. It had not occurred to anybody in the crowd, that simple trick of inquiring about somebody who wasn't 10,000 miles away. The magician was hit hard. It was an emergency that had never happened in his experience before, and it corked him. He didn't know how to meet it. He looked stunned, confused. He couldn't say a word. Come, I said. What are you waiting for? Is it impossible you can answer up right off and tell what anybody on the other side of the earth is doing, yet can't tell what a person is doing who isn't 3 yards from you? Persons behind me know what I'm doing with my right hand. They will endorse you if you tell correctly. He was still dumb. Very well, I'll tell you why you don't speak up and tell us, because you don't know. You, a magician. Good friends, this tramp is a mere fraud and liar. This distressed the monks and terrified them. They were not used to hearing these awful beings called names, and they did not know what might be the consequence. There was a dead silence now. Superstitious bodings were in every mind. The magician began to pull his wits together, and when he presently smiled, an easy, nonchalant smile, it spread a mighty relief around, for it indicated that his mood was not destructive. He said, "It hath struck me speechless, the frivolity of this person's speech. Let all know, if perchance there be any who know it not, that enchanters of my degree deign not to concern themselves with the doing of any but kings, princes, emperors, them that would be born in the purple, and them only. Had ye asked me what Arthur, the great king, is doing, it were another matter, and I had told you, but the doings of a subject interest me not." "Oh, I misunderstood you. I thought you said anybody, and I supposed anybody included, well, anybody that is everybody. It doth anybody that is of lofty birth, and the better if he be royal." "That it meseemeth may well be," said the abbot, who saw his opportunity to smooth things and avert disaster. "For it were not likely that so wonderful a gift as this would be conferred for the revelation of the concerns of lesser beings than such as be born near to the summits of greatness. Our Arthur the king—" "Would you know of him?" broke in the enchanter. "Most gladly, yea, and gratefully." Everybody was full of awe and interest again. Right away, the incorrigible idiots. They watched the incantations absorbingly and looked at me with a "There, now, what can you say to that?" air when the announcement came. "The king is weary with the chase, and lieth in his palace these 2 hours, sleeping a dreamless sleep." "God's benison upon him," said the abbot, and crossed himself. "May that sleep be to the refreshment of his body and his soul." "And so it might be, if he were sleeping," I said, "but the king is not sleeping. The king rides." Here was trouble again. A conflict of authority. Nobody knew which of us to believe. I still had some reputation left. The magician's scorn was stirred, and he said, "Lo, I have seen many wonderful soothsayers and prophets and magicians in my life days, but none before that could sit idle and see to the heart of things with never an incantation to help. You have lived in the woods and lost much by it. I use incantations myself, as this good brotherhood are aware, but only on occasions of moment. When it comes to sarcasming, I reckon I know how to keep my end up." That jab made this fellow squirm. The abbot inquired after the king and the court and got this information: "They be all on sleeping, overcome by fatigue, like as to the king." I said, "That is merely another lie. Half of them are about their amusements. The queen and the other half are not sleeping. They ride. Now perhaps you can spread yourself a little and tell us where the king and queen and all that are at this moment riding with them are going." "They sleep now," as I said, "but on the morrow they will ride, for they go a journey across the sea." "And where will they be the day after tomorrow at vespers?" "Far to the north of Camelot, and half their journey will be done." "That is another lie. By the space of 150 miles, their journey will not merely be half done; it will be all done, and they will be here in this valley." That was a noble shot. It set the abbot and the monks in a whirl of excitement, and it rocked the enchanter to his base. I followed the thing right up. "If the king does not arrive, I will have myself ridden on a rail. If he does, I will ride you on a rail instead." Next day, I went up to the telephone office and found that the king had passed through 2 towns that were on the line. I spotted his progress on the succeeding day in the same way. I kept these matters to myself. The 3rd day's report showed that if he kept up his gait, he would arrive by 4 in the afternoon. There was still no sign anywhere of interest in his coming. There seemed to be no preparations making to receive him in state. A strange thing, truly. Only one thing could explain this: that other magician had been cutting under me, sure. This was true. I asked a friend of mine, a monk, about it, and he said, yes, the magician had tried some further enchantments and found that the court had concluded to make no journey at all, but stay at home. Think of that! Observe how much a reputation was worth in such a country. These people had seen me do the very showiest bit of magic in history, and the only one within their memory that had a positive value, and yet here they were, ready to take up with an adventurer who could offer no evidence of his powers but his mere unproven word. However, it was not good politics to let the king come without any fuss and feathers at all, so I went down and drummed up a procession of pilgrims and smoked out a bunch of hermits and started them out at 2 o'clock to meet him. And that was the sort of state he arrived in. The abbot was helpless with rage and humiliation when I brought him out on a balcony and showed him the head of the state marching in, and never a monk on hand to offer him welcome, and no stir of life or clang of joy bell to glad his spirit. He took one look and then flew to rouse out his forces. The next minute the bells were dinning furiously, and the various buildings were vomiting monks and nuns, who went swarming in a rush toward the coming procession, and with them went that magician, and he was on a rail, too, by the abbot's order, and his reputation was in the mud, and mine was in the sky again. Yes, a man can keep his trademark current in such a country, but he can't sit around and do it. He's got to be on deck and attending to business right along. Chapter 25. A Competitive Examination. When the king traveled for change of air, or made a progress, or visited a distant noble whom he wished to bankrupt with the cost of his keep, part of the administration moved with him. It was a fashion of the time. The commission charged with the examination of candidates for posts in the army came with the king to the valley, whereas they could have transacted their business just as well at home. And although this expedition was strictly a holiday excursion for the king, he kept some of his business functions going just the same. He touched for the evil, as usual. He held court in the gate at sunrise and tried cases, for he was himself Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He shone very well in this latter office. He was a wise and humane judge, and he clearly did his honest best and fairest, according to his lights. That is a large reservation. His lights, his rearing, often colored his decisions. Whenever there was a dispute between a noble or gentleman and a person of lower degree, the king's leanings and sympathies were for the former class always, whether he suspected it or not. It was impossible that this should be otherwise. The blunting effects of slavery upon the slaveholder's moral perceptions are known and conceded the world over. And a privileged class, an aristocracy, is but a band of slaveholders under another name. This has a harsh sound, and yet should not be offensive to any, to even the noble himself, unless the fact itself be an offense, for the statement simply formulates a fact. The repulsive feature of slavery is the thing, not its name. One needs but to hear an aristocrat speak of the classes that are below him to recognize, and in but indifferently modified measure, the very air and tone of the actual slaveholder. And behind these are the slaveholder's spirit, the slaveholder's blunted feeling. They are the result of the same cause in both cases, the possessor's old and inbred custom of regarding himself as a superior being. The king's judgment wrought frequent injustices, but it was merely the fault of his training, his natural and unalterable sympathies. He was as unfitted for a judgeship as would be the average mother for the position of milk distributor to starving children in famine time. Her own children would fare a shade better than the rest. One very curious case came before the king. A young girl, an orphan, who had a considerable estate, married a fine young fellow who had nothing. The girl's property was within a seigneury held by the church. The bishop of the diocese, an arrogant scion of the great nobility, claimed the girl's estate on the ground that she had married privately, and thus had cheated the church out of one of its rights as lord of seigneury, the one hitherto referred to as les droits de seigneur. The penalty of refusal or avoidance was confiscation. The girl's defense was that the lordship of the seigneury was vested in the bishop, and the particular right here involved was not transferable, it must be exercised by the lord himself or stand vacated, and that an older law of the church itself strictly barred the bishop from exercising it. It was a very odd case indeed. It reminded me of something I'd read in my youth about the ingenious way in which the aldermen of London raised the money that built the Mansion House. A person who had not taken the sacrament, according to the Anglican rite, could not stand as a candidate for Sheriff of London. Thus dissenters were ineligible. They could not run if asked. They could not serve if elected. The aldermen, who without any question were Yankees in disguise, hit upon this neat device. They passed a bylaw imposing a fine of £400 upon anyone who should refuse to be a candidate for sheriff, and a fine of £600 upon any person who, after being elected sheriff, refused to serve. Then they went to work and elected a lot of dissenters, one after another, and kept it up until they collected £15,000 in fines, and there stands the stately Mansion House to this day to keep the blushing citizen in mind of a long past and lamented day when a band of Yankees slipped into London and played games of the sort that has given their race a unique and shady reputation among all truly good and holy people that be in the earth. The girl's case seemed strong to me. The bishop's case was just as strong. I did not see how the king was going to get out of this hole, but he got out. I penned his decision. Truly I find small difficulty here, the matter being even a child's affair for simpleness. And the young bride had conveyed notice, as in duty bound to her feudal lord and proper master and protector the bishop, she had suffered no loss, for the said bishop could have got a dispensation making him, for temporary conveniency, eligible to the exercise of his said right, and thus would she have kept all she had. Whereas, failing in her first duty, she hath by that failure failed in all, for whoso, clinging to a rope, severeth it above his hands, must fall, it being no defence to claim that the rest of the rope is sound, neither any deliverance from his peril as he shall find. Party, the woman's case is rotten at the source. It is the decree of the court that she forfeit to the said Lord Bishop all her goods, even to the last farthing that she doth possess, and there be thereto mulcted in the costs. Next, there was a tragic end to a beautiful honeymoon not yet 3 months old. Poor young creatures! They had lived these 3 months lapped to the lips in worldly comforts. These clothes and trinkets they were wearing were as fine and dainty as the shrewdest stretch of these sumptuary laws allowed to people of their degree. And in these pretty clothes, she crying on his shoulder, and he trying to comfort her with hopeful words set to the music of despair, they went from the judgment seat out into the world homeless, bedless, breadless. Why, the very beggars by the roadside were not so poor as they. Well, the king was out of the hole, and on terms satisfactory to the church and the rest of the aristocracy, no doubt. Men write many fine and plausible arguments in support of monarchy, but the fact remains that where every man in a state has a vote, brutal laws are impossible. Arthur's people were, of course, poor material for a republic because they had been debased so long by monarchy, and yet even they would have been intelligent enough to make short work of that law which the king had just been administering if it had been submitted to their full and free vote. There's a phrase which has grown so common in the world's mouth that it has come to seem to have sense and meaning. The sense and meaning implied when it is used. That is the phrase which refers to this or that or the other nation as possibly being capable of self-government. And the implied sense of it is that there has been a nation somewhere, sometime or other, that wasn't capable of it, wasn't as able to govern itself as some self-appointed specialists were or would be to govern it. The masterminds of all nations, in all ages, have sprung in affluent multitude from the mass of the nation, and from the mass of the nation only, not from its privileged classes, and so, no matter what the nation's intellectual grade was, whether low or high, that bulk of its ability was in the long ranks of its nameless and its poor, and so it never saw the day that it had not the material in abundance whereby to govern itself. Which is to assert an always self-proven fact that even the best governed and most free and most enlightened monarchy is still behind the best condition attainable by its people, and that the same is true of kindred governments of lower grade, all the way down to the lowest. King Arthur had hurried up the army business altogether beyond my calculations. I had not supposed he would move in the matter while I was away, and so I had not mapped out a scheme for determining the merits of officers. I had only remarked that it would be wise to submit every candidate to a sharp and searching examination. And privately, I meant to put together a list of military qualifications that nobody could answer to but my West Pointers. That ought to have been attended to before I left, for the king was so taken with the idea of a standing army that he couldn't wait but must get it about it at once and get as good a scheme of examination as he could invent out of his own head. I was impatient to see what this was, and to show, too, how much more admirable was the one that I should display to the examining board. I intimated this gently to the king, and it fired his curiosity. When the board was assembled, I followed him in, and behind us came the candidates. One of these candidates was a bright young West Pointer of mine, and with him were a couple of my West Point professors. When I saw the board, I did not know whether to cry or to laugh. The head of it was the officer known to later centuries as Norroy King-at-Arms. The other two members were chiefs of bureau in his department, and all three were priests, of course. All officials who had to know how to read and write were priests. My candidate was called first, out of courtesy to me, and the head of the board opened on him with official solemnity. Name? Malise, son of Webster. Aye. My memory faileth to recall the name. Condition? Weaver. God keep us! The king was staggered from his summit to his foundations. One clerk fainted, and the others came near it. The chairman pulled himself together and said indignantly, It is sufficient, get you hence. But I appealed to the king. I begged that my candidate might be examined. The king was willing, but the board, who were all well-born folk, implored the king to spare them the indignity of examining the weaver's son. I knew they didn't know enough to examine him anyway, so I joined my prayers to theirs, and the king turned the duty over to my professors. I'd had a blackboard prepared, and it was put up now, and the circus began. It was beautiful to hear the lad lay out the science of war and wallow in details of battle and siege, of supply, transportation, mining and countermining, grand tactics, big strategy and little strategy, signal service, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and all about siege guns, field guns, Gatling guns, rifled guns, smooth bores, musket practice, revolver practice, and not a solitary word of it could these catfish make head or tail of, you understand. And it was handsome to see him chalk off mathematical nightmares on the blackboard that would stump the angels themselves, and do it like nothing, too. All about ellipses and comets and solstices and constellation and meantime and sidereal time and dinner time and bedtime and every other imaginable thing above the clouds or under them that you could harry or bullyrag an enemy with and make him wish he hadn't come. And when the boy made his military salute and stood aside at last, I was proud enough to hug him. And all those other people were so dazed they looked partly petrified, partly drunk, and wholly caught out and snowed under. I judged that the cake was ours, and by a large majority. Education is a great thing. This was the same youth who had come to West Point so ignorant when I asked him, if a general officer should have a horse shot under him on the field of battle, what ought he to do? Answered up naively and said, get up and brush himself. One of the young nobles was called up now. I thought he would question him a little myself. I said, can your lordship read? His face flushed indignantly, and he fired this at me. Takest me for a clerk? I trow I am not of a blood that. Answer the question. He crowded his wrath down and made out to answer, no. Can you write? He wanted to resent this too, but I said, you will confine yourself to the questions and make no comments. You're not here to air your blood or your graces, and nothing of the sort will be permitted. Can you write? No. Do you know the multiplication table? I wit not to what ye refer to. How much is 9 times 6? It is a mystery that is hidden from me by reason that the emergency requiring the fathom of it hath not in my lifetime occurred. And so, not having any need to know this thing, I abide barren of the knowledge. If A trade a barrel of onions to B, worth 2 pence the bushel, in exchange for a sheep worth 4 pence and a dog worth a penny, and C kill the dog before delivery because bitten by the same, who mistook him for D, what sum is still due to A from B, and which party pays for the dog, C or D, and who gets the money? If A, is the penny insufficient, or may he claim consequential damages in the form of additional money to represent the possible profit which might have inured from the dog, and is classifiable as earned increment, that is to say, usufruct? Verily, in the all-wise and unknowable providence of God, who moveth in mysterious ways his wonders to perform, have I never heard the fellow to this question for confusion of the mind and constipation of the ducts of thought. Wherefore, I beseech you, let the dog and the onions and these people of the strange and godless names work out their several salvations from the piteous and wonderful difficulties without help of mine. For indeed their trouble is sufficient as it is. Whereas an I tried to help, I should but damage their cause the more, and yet mayhap not live myself to see the desolation wrought. What do you know about the laws of attraction and gravitation? If there be such, mayhap his grace the king did promulgate them whilst I lay sick about the beginning of the year, and thereby failed to hear his proclamation. What do you know about the science of optics? I know of governors of places, and seneschals of castles, and sheriffs of counties, and many such like small offices and titles of honor, but him you call the science of optics I have not heard of before. Peradventure it is a new dignity. Yes, in this country. Try to conceive of this mollusk gravely applying for an official position of any kind under the sun. Why, he had all the earmarks of a typewriter copyist if you leave out the disposition to contribute uninvited emendations of your grammar and punctuation. It was unaccountable that he didn't attempt a little help of that sort out of his majestical supply of incapacity for the job. But that didn't prove he hadn't material in him for the disposition. It only proved that he wasn't a typewriter copyist yet. After nagging him a little more, I let the professors loose on him, and they turned him inside out on the line of scientific war, and found him empty, of course. He knew somewhat about the warfare of the time, bushwhacking about for ogres and bullfights in the tournament ring and such things, but otherwise he was empty and useless. Then we took the other young noble in hand, and he was the first one's twin for ignorance and incapacity. I delivered them into the hands of the chairman of the board with the comfortable consciousness that their cake was dough. They were examined in the previous order of precedence. Name, so please you, Pertipole, son of Sir Pertipole, Baron of Barley Mash. Grandfather, also Sir Pertipole, Baron of Barley Mash. Great-grandfather, the same name and title. Great-great-grandfather. We had none, worshipful sir, the line failing before it had reached so far back. It mattereth not, it is a good 4 generations, and fulfilleth the requirements of the rule. Fulfills what rule? I asked. The rule requiring 4 generations of nobility, or else the candidate is not eligible. A man not eligible for a lieutenancy in the army unless he can prove 4 generations of noble descent? Even so, neither the lieutenant nor any other officer may be commissioned without that qualification. Oh, come, that's an astonishing thing. What good is such a qualification as that? What good? It is a hardy question, fair sir and boss, since it doth go far to impugn the wisdom of even our holy Mother Church herself. As how? For that she hath established the selfsame rule regarding saints. By her law none may be canonized till he hath lain dead 4 generations. I see. It is the same thing. It is wonderful. In the one case, a man lies dead alive 4 generations, mummified in ignorance and sloth, and that qualifies him to command live people and take their weal and woe into his impotent hands. And in the other case, a man lies bedded with death and worms 4 generations, and that qualifies him for office in the celestial camp. Does the king's grace approve of this strange law? The king said, Why, truly, I see naught about it that is strange. All places of honor and of profit do belong by natural right to them that be of noble blood. And so these dignities in the army are their property, and would be so without this or any other rule. The rule is but to mark a limit. Its purpose is to keep out too recent blood, which would bring into contempt these offices. And men of lofty lineage would turn their backs and scorn to take them. I were to blame, and I permitted this calamity. You can permit it, and you are minded so to do, for you have the delegated authority. But that the king should do it were a most strange madness, and not comprehensible to any. I yield. Proceed, Sir Chief of the Heralds' College. The chairman resumed as follows. By what illustrious achievement for the honor of the throne and state did the founder of your great line lift himself to the sacred dignity of the British nobility? He built a brewery. So the board finds this candidate perfect in all the requirements and qualifications for military command, and doth hold his case open for decision after due examination of his competitor. The competitor came forward and proved exactly 4 generations of nobility himself. So there was a tie in military qualifications that far. He stood aside a moment, and Sir Pertipole was questioned further. Of what condition was the wife of the founder of your line? She came from the highest landed gentry, yet she was not noble. She was gracious and pure and charitable, of a blameless life and character, insomuch that in these regards was she peer of the best lady in the land. That will do, stand down. He called up the competing lordling again, and asked, What was the rank and condition of the great-grandmother who conferred British nobility upon your great house? She was a king's layman, and did climb to that splendid eminence by her own unholpen merit from the sower where she was born. Ah, this indeed is true nobility. This is the right and perfect intermixture. The lieutenancy is yours, fair lord. Hold it not in contempt. It is the humble step which will lead to grandeurs more worthy of the splendor of an origin like to thine. I was down in the bottomless pit of humiliation. I had promised myself an easy and zenith-scouring triumph, and this was the outcome. I was almost ashamed to look my poor, disappointed cadet in the face. I told him to go home and be patient. This wasn't the end. I had a private audience with the king and made a proposition. I said that it was quite right to officer that regiment with nobilities, and he couldn't have done a wiser thing. It would also be a good idea to add 500 officers to it. In fact, add as many officers as there were nobles and relatives of nobles in the country, even if there should finally be 5 times as many officers as privates in it, and thus make it the crack regiment, the envied regiment, the king's own regiment, and entitled to fight on its own hook and in its own way, and go whether it would, and come when it pleased in time of war, and be utterly swell and independent. This would make that regiment the heart's desire of all the nobility, and they would all be satisfied and happy. Then we would make up the rest of the standing army out of commonplace materials, and officer it with nobodies, as was proper. Nobodies selected on a basis of mere efficiency, and would make this regiment toe the line, allow it no aristocratic freedom from restraint, and force it to do all the work and persist in hammering to the end that wherever the king's own was tired and wanted to go off for a change and rummage around amidst ogres and have a good time, it could go without uneasiness, knowing that matters were in safe hands behind it. And business was going to be continued at the old stand, same as usual. The king was charmed with the idea. When I noticed that, it gave me a valuable notion. I thought I saw my way out of an old and stubborn difficulty at last. You see, the royalties of the Pendragon stock were of a long-lived race and very fruitful. Whenever a child was born to any of these, and it was pretty often, there was wild joy in the nation's mouth and piteous sorrow in the nation's heart. The joy was questionable, but the grief was honest, because the event meant another call for a royal grant. Long was the list of these royalties, and they were a heavy and steadily increasing burden upon the treasury and a menace to the crown. Yet Arthur could not believe this latter fact, and he would not listen to any of my various projects for substituting something in the place of the royal grants. If I could have persuaded him to now and then provide a support for one of these outlying scions from his own pocket, I could have made a grant to do over it, and it would have had such a good effect with the nation. But no, he wouldn't hear of such a thing. He had something like a religious passion for a royal grant. He seemed to look upon it as a sort of sacred swag, and one could not irritate him in any way so quickly and so surely as by an attack upon that venerable institution. If I ventured to cautiously hint that there was not another respectable family in England that would humble itself to hold out the hat, however, that is as far as I ever got, he would always cut me short there, and peremptorily too. But I believe I saw my chance at last. I would form this crack regiment out of officers alone, not a single private. Half of it should consist of nobles who should fill up all the places up to major general and serve gratis and pay their own expenses, and they would be glad to do this when they should learn that the rest of the regiment would consist exclusively of princes of the blood. These princes of the blood should range in rank from lieutenant general up to field marshal and be gorgeously salaried and equipped and fed by the state. Moreover, and this was the master stroke, it should be decreed that these princely grandees should always be addressed by a stunningly gaudy and awe-compelling title, which I would presently invent, and they only in all England should be so addressed. Finally, all princes of the blood should have free choice. Join that regiment, get that great title, and renounce the royal grant, or stay out and receive a grant. Neatest touch of all, unborn but imminent princes of the blood could be born into the regiment and start fair with good wages and a permanent situation upon due notice from the parents. All the boys would join, I was sure that, so all existing grants would be relinquished. That the newly born would always join was equally certain. Within 60 days, that quaint and bizarre anomaly, the royal grant, would cease to be a living fact and take its place among the curiosities of the past. Chapter 26, the first newspaper. When I told the king I was going out disguised as a petty freeman to scour the country and familiarize myself with the humbler life of the people, he was all afire with the novelty of the thing in a minute, and was bound to take a chance in the adventure himself. Nothing should stop him. He would drop everything and go along. It was the prettiest idea he had run across for many a day. He wanted to glide out the back way and start at once, but I showed him that wouldn't answer. You see, he was billed for the king's evil. To touch for it, I mean, and it wouldn't be right to disappoint the house, and it wouldn't make a delay worth considering anyway. It was only a one-night stand. And I thought he ought to tell the queen he was going away. He clouded up at that and looked sad. I was sorry I'd spoken, especially when he said mournfully, "Thou forgettest that Lancelot is here, and where Lancelot is, she noteth not the going forth of the king, nor what day he returneth." Of course I changed the subject. Yes, Guinevere was beautiful, it is true, but take her all around, she was pretty slack. Never meddled much in these matters. They weren't my affair, but I did hate to see the way things were going on, and I don't mind saying that much. Many of the times she had asked me, "Sir Boss, hast seen Sir Lancelot about?" But if ever she went fretting around for the king, I didn't happen to be around at the time. There was a very good layout for the king's evil business, very tidy and credible. The king sat under a canopy of state. About him were clustered a large body of the clergy in full canonicals. Conspicuous both for location and personal outfit stood Marinell, a hermit of the quack doctor species, to introduce the sick. All abroad over the spacious floor and clear down to the doors, in a thick jumble, lay or sat the scrofulous under a strong light. It was as good as a tableau. In fact, it had all the look of being gotten up for that, though it wasn't. There were 800 sick people present. The work was slow. It lacked the interest of novelty for me because I had seen the ceremonies before. The things soon became tedious, but the proprieties required me to stick it out. The doctor was there for the reason that in all such crowds there were many people who only imagined something was the matter with them, and many who were consciously sound but wanted the immortal honor of fleshly contact with the king, and yet others who pretended to illness in order to get the piece of coin that went with the touch. Up to this time, this coin had been a wee little gold piece worth about a third of a dollar. When you consider how much that amount of money would buy in that day and age and country, and how usual it was to be scrofulous when not dead, you will understand that the annual king's evil approbation was just the river and harbor bill of that government for the grip it took on the treasury and the chance it afforded for skinning the surplus. So I had privately concluded to touch the treasury itself for the king's evil. I covered 6/7 of the appropriation into the treasury a week before starting from Camelot on my adventures, in order that the other seventh be inflated into 5-cent nickels and delivered into the hands of the head clerk of the king's evil department. A nickel to take the place of each gold coin, you see, and do its work for it. It might strain the nickel some, but I judged it could stand it. As a rule, I do not approve of watering stock, but I considered it fair enough in this case, for it was just a gift anyway. Of course, you can water a gift as much as you want to, and I generally do. The old gold and silver coins of the country were of ancient and unknown origin, as a rule, but some of them were Roman, they were ill-shapen, and seldom rounder than a moon that is a week past the full. They were hammered, not minted, and they were so worn with use that the devices upon them were as illegible as blisters, and looked like them. I judged that a sharp, bright new nickel, with a first-rate likeness of the king on one side, and Guinevere on the other, and a blooming, pious motto, would take the tuck out of scrofula as handily as a nobler coin and please the scrofula's fancy more. And I was right. This batch was the first it was tried on, and it worked to a charm. The saving in expense was a notable economy. You will see that by these figures we touched a trifle over 700 of the 800 patients. At former rates, this would have cost the government about $240. At the new rate, we pulled through for about $35, thus saving upward of $200 at one swoop. To appreciate the full magnitude of this stroke, consider these other figures. The annual expenses of a national government amount to the equivalent of a contribution of 3 days' average wages to every individual of the population, counting every individual as if he were a man. If you take a nation of 60 million, where average wages are $2 per day, 3 days' wages taken from each individual will provide $360 million and pay the government's expenses. In my day, in my own country, this money was collected from imposts, and the citizen imagined that the foreigner importer paid it, and it made it comfortable to think so, whereas in fact it was paid by the American people, and was so equally and exactly distributed among them that the annual cost to the 100 millionaire and the annual cost to the suckling child of the day laborer was precisely the same. Each paid $6. Nothing could be equaler than that, I reckon. Well, Scotland and Ireland were tributary to Arthur, and the united populations of the British Isles amounted to something less than 1 million. A mechanic's average wage was 3 cents a day when he paid his own keep. By this rule, the national government's expenses were $90,000 a year, or about $250 a day. Thus, by the substitution of nickels for gold on a king's evil day, I not only injured no one, dissatisfied no one, but pleased all concerned and saved 4/5 of that day's national expense into the bargain, a saving which would have been the equivalent of $800,000 in my day in America. In making this substitution, I had drawn upon the wisdom of a very remote source, the wisdom of my boyhood. For the true statesman does not despise any wisdom, however lowly may be its origin. In my boyhood, I had always saved my pennies and contributed buttons to the foreign missionary cause. The buttons would answer the ignorant savage as well as the coin would answer me better than the buttons. All hands were happy and nobody hurt. Marinell took the patients as they came. He examined the candidate. If he couldn't qualify, he was warned off. If he could, he was passed along to the king. A priest pronounced the words, "They shall lay their hands on the sick and they shall recover." Then the king stroked the ulcers while the reading continued. Finally, the patient graduated and got his nickel, the king hanging it around his neck himself, and was dismissed. Would you think that would cure? It certainly did. Any mummery will cure if the patient's faith is strong in it. Up by Astolat, there was a chapel where the Virgin had once appeared to a girl who used to herd geese around there. The girl said so herself. And they built the chapel upon that spot and hung a picture in it representing the occurrence, a picture which you would think it dangerous for a sick person to approach, whereas, on the contrary, thousands of the lame and the sick came and prayed before it every year and went away whole and sound, and even the well could look upon it and live. Of course, when I was told these things, I did not believe them, but when I went there and saw them, I had to succumb. I saw the cures affected myself, and they were real cures and not questionable. I saw cripples whom I had seen around Camelot for years on crutches arrive and pray before that picture and put down the crutches and walk off without a limp. There were piles of crutches there which had been left by such people as a testimony. In other places, people operated on a patient's mind without saying a word to him and cured him. In others, experts assembled patients in a room and prayed over them and appealed to their faith, and those patients went away cured. Wherever you find a king who can't cure the king's evil, you can be sure that the most valuable superstition that supports his throne, the subject's belief in the divine appointment of his sovereign, has passed away. In my youth, the monarchs of England had ceased to touch for the evil, but there was no occasion for this diffidence. They could have cured it 49 times in 50. Well, when the priest had been droning for 3 hours, and the good king polishing the evidences, and the sick were still pressing forward as plenty as ever, I got to feeling intolerably bored. I was sitting by an open window not far from the canopy of state. For the 500th time, a patient stood forward to have his repulsiveness stroked. Again those words were being droned out, "They shall lay their hands upon the sick," when outside there rang clear as a clarion a note that enchanted my soul and tumbled 13 worthless centuries about my ears. "Camelot Weekly Hosanna and Literary Volcano! Latest eruption, only 2 cents, all about the big miracle in the Valley of Holiness." One greater than kings had arrived, the newsboy. But I was the only person in all that throng who knew the meaning of this mighty birth, and what this imperial magician was come into the world to do. I dropped a nickel out the window and got my paper. The Adam newsboy of the world went round the corner to get my change, is around the corner yet. It was delicious to see a newspaper again, yet I was conscious of a secret shock when my eye fell upon the first batch of display headlines. I had lived in a clammy atmosphere of reverence, respect, deference so long that they sent a quivery little cold wave through me. High times in the Valley of Holiness. The water morks corked. Brer Merlin works his arts but gets left. But the boss scores in his first innings. The miraculous well uncorked amid awful outbursts of infernal fire and smoke and thunder. The buzzard roost astonished. Unparalleled rejoinings. And so on, and so on. Yes, it was too loud. Once I could have enjoyed it and seen nothing out of the way about it, but now its note was discordant. It was good Arkansas journalism, but this was not Arkansas. Moreover, the next to the last line was calculated to give offense to the hermits and perhaps lose us their advertising. Indeed, there was too lightsome a tone of flippancy all through the paper. It was plain I had undergone a considerable change without noticing it. I found myself unpleasantly affected by pert little irreverences which would have seemed but proper and airy graces of speech at an earlier period in my life. There was an abundance of the following breed of items, and they discomforted me. Local smoke and cinders. Sir Lancelot met up with old King Grievance of Ireland unexpectedly last week over on the moor south of Sir Balmoral les Merveuses du hog pasture. The widow has been notified. Expedition number 3 will start about the 1st of next month on a search for Sir Sagramore le Desirous. It is in command of the renowned Knight of the Red Lawns, assisted by Sir Persant of Indy, who is competent, intelligent, courteous, and in every way a brick, and further assisted by Sir Palomides, the Saracen, who is no huckleberry himself. This is no picnic. These boys mean business. The readers of the Hosanna will regret to learn that the handsome and popular Sir Charlet of Gaul, who during his 4-week stay at the Bull and Halibut the city has won every heart by his polished manners and elegant conversation, will pull out today for home. Give us another call, Charlie. The business end of the funeral, the late Sir Dalliance, the Duke's son of Cornwall, killed in an encounter with the giant of the knotted bludgeon last Tuesday on the borders of the Plain of Enchantment, was in the hands of the ever affable and efficient Mumble, Prince of Undertakers, than whom there exists none but by whom it were a more satisfying pleasure to have the last sad offices performed. Give him a trial. The cordial thanks of the Hosanna officers are due, from editor down to devil, to the ever-courteous and thoughtful Lord High Steward of the Palace's thride assistant valet for several saucers of ice cream of a quality calculated to make the eyes of the recipients humid with gratitude, and it done it. When this administration wants to chalk up a desirable name for early promotion, the Hosanna would like a chance to suggest. The demoiselle Irene Dewlap of South Astolat is visiting her uncle, the popular host of the cattleman's boarding horse liver lane, the city. Young Barker, the bellows mender, is home again and looks much improved by his vacation roundup among the outlying smithies. See his ad. Of course, it was quite good enough journalism for a beginning. I knew that quite well, and yet it was somehow disappointing. The court circular pleased me better. Indeed, its simple and dignified respectfulness was a distinct refreshment to me after all those disgraceful familiarities. But even it could have been improved. Do what one may, there is no getting an air of variety into a court circular. I acknowledge that. There's a profound monotonous about its facts that baffles and defeats one's sincerest efforts to make them sparkle and enthuse. The best way to manage, in fact, the only sensible way, is to disguise repetitiousness of fact under variety of form. Skin your fact each time and lay on a new cuticle of words. It deceives the eye. You think it is a new fact. It gives you the idea that the court is carrying on like everything. This excites you, and you drain the whole column with a good appetite, and perhaps never notice that it is a barrel of soup made out of a single bean. Clarence's way was good. It was simple. It was dignified. It was direct and businesslike. All I say is, it was not the best way. On Monday, the king rode in the park. Tuesday, same. Wednesday, same. Thursday, same. Friday, same. Saturday, same. Sunday, same. However, take the paper by and large, I was vastly pleased with it. Little crudities of a mechanical sort were observable here and there, but there were not enough of them to amount to anything, and it was good enough Arkansas proofreading anyhow, and better than it was needed in Arthur's day and realm. As a rule, the grammar was leaky and the construction more or less lame, but I did not much mind these things. They are common defects of my own, and one mustn't criticize other people on grounds where he can't stand perpendicular himself. I was hungry enough for literature to want to take down the whole paper at this one meal, but I got only a few bites and then had to postpone, because the monks around me besieged me so with eager questions. What is this curious thing? What is it for? Is it a handkerchief, saddle blanket, part of a shirt? What is it made of? How thin it is, and how dainty and frail, and how it rattles. Will it wear, do you think, and won't the rain injure it? Is it writing that appears on it, or is it only ornamentation? They suspected it was writing because those among them who knew how to read Latin and had a smattering of Greek recognized some of the letters, but they can make nothing out of the result as a whole. I put my information in the simplest form I could. It is a public journal. I will explain what that is another time. It is not cloth. It is made of paper. Sometime I will explain what paper is. The lines on it are reading matter and not written by hand, but printed. By and by I will explain what printing is. 1,000 of these sheets have been made, all exactly like this, in every minute detail. They can't be told apart. They all broke out with exclamations of surprise and admiration. 1,000? Verily a mighty work, a year's work for many men. No, nearly a day's work for a man and a boy. They crossed themselves and whiffed out a protective prayer or two. Ah, a miracle, a wonder, dark work of enchantment. I let it go at that. Then I read in a low voice to as many as could crowd their shaven heads within hearing distance, part of the account of the miracle of the restoration of the well. It was accompanied by astonished and reverent ejaculations all through. Ah, how true! Amazing, amazing! These be the very haps as they happened in marvelous exactness. And might they take this strange thing in their hands and feel it and examine it? They would be very careful. Yes, so they took it, handling it as cautiously and devoutly as if it had been some holy thing come from some supernatural region, and gently felt of its texture, and caressed its pleasant, smooth surface with lingering touch, and scanned the mysterious characters with fascinated eyes. These grouped bent heads, these charmed faces, these speaking eyes, how beautiful to me! For was not this my darling, and was not all this mute wonder and interest and homage a most elegant tribute and unforced compliment to it? I knew then how a mother feels when women, whether strangers or friends, take her new baby and close themselves about it with one eager impulse and bend their heads over it in a tranced adoration that makes all the rest of the universe vanish out of their consciousness and be as if it were not for that time. I knew how she feels, and that there is no other satisfied ambition, whether of king, conqueror, or poet, that ever reaches halfway to that serene far summit or yields half so divine a contentment. During all the rest of the seance, my paper traveled from group to group, all up and down and about that huge hall, and my happy eye was upon it always, and I sat motionless, steeped in satisfaction, drunk with enjoyment. Yes, this was heaven. I was tasting it once, if I might never taste it more. Chapter 27. The Yankee and the King Travel Incognito. About bedtime, I took the king to my private quarters to cut his hair and help him get the hang of the lowly raiment he was to wear. The high classes wore their hair banged across the forehead, but hanging to the shoulders the rest of the way around, whereas the lowest ranks of commoners were banged fore and aft both. The slaves were bangless and allowed their hair free growth. So I inverted a bowl over his head and cut away all the locks that hung below it. I also trimmed his whiskers and mustache till they were only about a half-inch long, and tried to do it inartistically and succeeded. It was a villainous disfigurement. When he got his lubberly sandals on and his long robe of coarse brown linen cloth, which hung straight from his neck to his ankle bones, he was no longer the comeliest man in his kingdom, but one of the unhandsomest, most commonplace and unattractive. We were dressed and barbered alike, and could pass for small farmers, or farm bailiffs, or shepherds, or carters, yes, or for village artisans if we chose, our costume being in effect universal among the poor because of its strength and cheapness. I don't mean that it was really cheap to a very poor person, but I do mean that it was the cheapest material there was for male attire, manufactured material, you understand. We slipped away an hour before dawn, and by broad sunup had made 8 or 10 miles, and were in the midst of a sparsely settled country. I had a pretty heavy knapsack. It was laden with provisions for the king to taper down on till he could take to the coarse fare of the country without damage. I found a comfortable seat for the king by the roadside, and then gave him a morsel or two to stay his stomach with. Then I said I would find some water for him, and strolled away. Part of my project was to get out of sight and sit down and rest a little myself. It has always been my custom to stand when in his presence, even at the council board, except upon those rare occasions when the sitting was a very long one, extending over hours. Then I had a trifling little backless thing, which was like a reverse culvert, and was as comfortable as the toothache. I didn't want to break him in suddenly, but do it by degrees. We should have to sit together now when in company, or people would notice, but it would not be good politics for me to be playing equality with him when there was no necessity for it. I found the water some 300 yards away, and been resting 20 minutes when I heard voices. That is all right, I thought, peasants going to work, nobody else likely to be stirring this early. But the next moment these comers jingled into sight around a turn of the road, smartly clad people of quality, with luggage mules and servants in their train. I was off like a shot through those bushes by the shortest cut. And for a while it did seem these people would pass the king before I could get to him. But desperation gives you wings, you know, and I canted my body forward, inflated my breast, and held my breath and flew. I arrived, and in plenty good enough time. "Pardon, my king, but it's no comment. No time for ceremony. Jump to your feet. Some quality are coming." "Is that a marvel? Let them come." "But my liege, you must not be seen sitting. Rise, and stand in humble posture while they pass. You are a peasant, you know." True, I had forgotten, so lost was I in planning of a huge war with Gaul. He was up by this time, but a farm could have got up quicker if there's any kind of boom in real estate. And right so thought came randoming overthwart this majestic dream, the which, humbler attitude, my lord the king, and quick, tuck your head, more, still more, droop it. He did his honest best, but lord, it was no great thing. He looked as humble as the leaning tower of Pisa. It is the most you can say of it. Indeed, it was such a thundering poor success that it raised wondering scowls all along the line, and a gorgeous flunky at the tail end of it raised his whip. But I jumped in time and was under it when it fell, and under cover of the volley of coarse laughter which followed. I spoke up sharply and warned the king not to take notice. He mastered himself for the moment, but it was a sore tax. He wanted to eat up the procession. I said it would end our adventures at the very start, and we, being without weapons, could do nothing with that armed gang. If we are to succeed in our emprise, we must only look the peasant, but act the peasant. It is wisdom, none can gainsay it. Let us go on, Sir Boss. I will take note and learn and do the best I may. He kept his word. He did the best he could, but I've seen better. If you've ever seen an active, heedless, enterprising child going diligently out of one mischief and into another all day long, and an anxious mother at its heels all the while, and just saving it by a hair from drowning itself or breaking its neck with each new experiment, you've seen the king in me. If I could have foreseen what the thing was going to be like, I could have said, no, if anybody wants to make his living exhibiting a king as a peasant, let him take the layout. I can do better with a menagerie and last longer. And yet, during the first 3 days, I never allowed him to enter a hut or other dwelling. If he could pass muster anywhere during his early novitiate, it would be in small inns and on the road, so as to these places we confined ourselves. Yet he certainly did the best he could, but what of what? What of that? He didn't improve a bit that I could see. He was always frightening me, always breaking out with new astonishers in new and unexpected places. Toward evening on the second day, what does he do but blandly fetch out a dirk from inside his robes? Great guns, my liege, where did you get that? From a smuggler at the inn yestereve. What in the world possessed you to buy it? We have escaped divers dangers by thy wit, but I have bethought me that it were but prudence if I bore a weapon too, that I might fail thee in some pinch. But people of our condition are not allowed to carry arms. What would a lord say? Yes, or any other person of whatever condition if he caught an upstart peasant with a dagger on his person? It was a lucky thing for us that nobody came along just then. I persuaded him to throw the dirk away, and it was as easy as persuading a child to give up some new, fresh way of killing itself. We walked along, silent and thinking. Finally, the king said, when ye know that I meditate a thing inconvenient, or that hath a peril in it, why do you not warn me to cease from that project? It was a startling question and a puzzler. I didn't quite know how to take hold of it, or what to say, and so of course I ended by saying the natural thing. But sire, how can I know what your thoughts are? The king stopped dead in his tracks and stared at me. I believe thou wert greater than Merlin, and truly in magic thou art. But prophecy is greater than magic. Merlin is a prophet. I saw I had made a blunder. I must get back my lost ground. After deep reflection and careful planning, I said, Sir, I have been misunderstood. I will explain. There are two kinds of prophecy. One is the gift to foretell things that are but a little way off. The other is the gift to foretell things that are whole ages and centuries away. Which is the mightier gift, do you think? Oh, the last, most surely. True. Does Merlin possess it? Partly, yes. He foretold mysteries about my birth and future kingship that were 20 years away. Has he ever gone beyond that? He would not claim more, I would think. It is probably his limit. All prophets have their limit. The limit of some of the great prophets has been the 100 years. These are few, I ween. There have been two still greater ones, whose limit was 400 and 600 years, and one whose limit compassed even 720. Gramercy, it is marvelous. But what are these in comparison with me? They are nothing. What? Canst thou truly look beyond even so vast a stretch of time as 700 years? My liege, as clear as the vision of an eagle does my prophetic eye penetrate and lay bare the future of this world for nearly 13 centuries and a half. My land, you should have seen the king's eyes spread slowly open and lift the earth's entire atmosphere as much as an inch. That settled Brer Merlin. One had never had any occasion to prove his facts with these people. All he had to do was state them. It never occurred to anybody to doubt the statement. Now, then, I continued, I could work both kinds of prophecy, the long and the short, if I choose to take the trouble to keep in practice, but I seldom exercise any but the long kind, because the other is beneath my dignity. It is proper to Merlin's sort, stump-tail prophets, as we call them in the profession. Of course, I wet up now and then and flirt out a minor prophecy, but not often, hardly ever, in fact. You remember that there was great talk when you reached the Valley of Holiness of my having prophesied your coming in the very hour of your arrival 2 or 3 days beforehand. Indeed, yes, I mind it now. Well, I could have done it as many as 40 times easier and applied on 1,000 times more detail into the bargain if it had been 500 years away instead of 2 or 3 days. How amazing that it should be so. Yes, a genuine expert can always foretell a thing that is 500 years away easier than he can a thing that's only 500 seconds off. And yet in reason it should clearly be the other way. It should be 500 times as easy to foretell the last as the first. For indeed it is so close by that one uninspired might almost see it. In truth, the law of prophecy doth contradict the likelihoods, most strangely making the difficult easy and the easy difficult. It was a wise head. Peasant's cap was no safe disguise for it. You could know it for a king's under a diving bell if you could hear it work its intellect. I had a new trade now and plenty of business in it. The king was as hungry to find out everything that was going to happen during the next 13 centuries as if he were expecting to live in them. For that time out, I prophesied myself bald-headed, trying to supply the demand. I've done some indiscreet things in my day, but this thing of playing myself for a prophet was the worst. Still, it had its ameliorations. A prophet doesn't have to have any brains. They're good to have, of course, for the ordinary exigencies of life, but they are no use in professional work. It is the restfulest vocation there is. When the spirit of prophecy comes upon you, you merely cake your intellect and lay it off in a cool place for a rest, and unship your jaw and leave it alone. It will work itself. The rest is prophecy. Every day a knight-errant or so came along, and the sight of them fired the king's martial spirit every time. He would have forgotten himself, sure, and said something to them in a style of a suspicious shade or so above his ostensible degree, and so I always got him well out of the road in time. Then he would stand and look with all his eyes, and a proud light would flash from him, and his nostrils would inflate like a war horse's, and I knew he was longing for a brush with them. But about noon of the third day I had stopped in the road to take a precaution which had been suggested by the whip stroke that had fallen to my share 2 days before, a precaution which I had afterward decided to leave untaken. I was so loath to institute it, but now I had just had a fresh reminder, while striding heedlessly along with jaw spread and intellect at rest, for I was prophesizing. I stubbed my toe and fell sprawling. I was so pale I couldn't think for a moment. Then I got softly and carefully up and unstrapped my knapsack. I had that dynamite bomb in it, done up in wool in a box. It was a good thing to have along. The time would come when I could do a valuable miracle with it, maybe, but it was a nervous thing to have about me, and I didn't like to ask the king to carry it. Yet I must either throw it away or think up some safe way to get along with its society. I got it out and slipped it into my script, and just then here come a couple of knights. The king stood, stately as a statue, gazing toward them, had forgotten himself again, of course, and before I could get a word of warning out, it was time for him to skip, and well that he did it too. He supposed they would turn aside. Turn aside to avoid trampling peasant dirt underfoot? When did he ever turn aside himself, or ever even had the chance to do it if a peasant saw him or any other noble knight in time to judiciously save him the trouble? The knights paid no attention to the king at all. It was his place to look out himself, and if he hadn't skipped, he would have been placidly ridden down and laughed at besides. The king was in a flaming fury and launched out his challenges and epithets with the most royal vigor. The knights were some little distance by now. They halted, greatly surprised, and turned in their saddles and looked back, as if wondering if it might be worthwhile to bother with such scum as we. They wheeled and started for us. Not a moment must be lost. I started for them. I passed them at a rattling gait, and as I went by, I flung out a hair-lifting, soul-scorching, 13-jointed insult, which made the king's effort poor and cheap by comparison. I got it out of the 19th century, where they know how. They had such headway that they were nearly to the king before they could check up. Then, frantic with rage, they stood up their horses on their hind hooves and whirled them around, and the next moment here they came, breast to breast. I was 70 yards off then, and scrambling up a great boulder on the roadside. When they were within 30 yards of me, they let their long lances droop to a level, depressed their mailed heads, and so, with their horsehair plumes streaming straight out behind, most gallant to see, this lightning express came tearing for me. When they were within 15 yards, I sent that bomb with a sure aim, and it struck the ground just under the horses' noses. Yes, it was a neat thing, very neat and pretty to see. It resembled a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi, and during the next 15 minutes we stood under a steady drizzle of microscopic fragments of knights and hardware and horseflesh. I say we, for the king joined the audience, of course, as soon as he had got his breath again. There was a hole there which would afford steady work for all the people in that region for some years to come. In trying to explain it, I mean. As for filling it up, that service would be comparatively prompt and would fall to the lot of a select few. Peasants of that seniority, and they wouldn't get anything for it either. But I explained it to the king myself. I said it was done with a dynamite bomb. This information did him no damage because it left him as intelligent as he was before. However, it was a noble miracle in his eyes and was another settler for Merlin. I thought it well enough to explain that this was a miracle of so rare a sort that it couldn't be done except when the atmospheric conditions were just right. Otherwise, he would be encoring it every time we had a good subject, and that would be inconvenient because I hadn't any more bombs along. Chapter 28, Drilling the King. On the morning of the fourth day, when it was just sunrise and we had been tramping an hour in the chill dawn, I came to a resolution. The king must be drilled. Things could not go on so. He must be taken in hand and deliberately and consciously conscientiously drilled, or we couldn't ever venture to enter a dwelling. The very cats would know this masquerader for a humbug, and no peasant. So I called a halt and said, Sire, as between clothes and countenance, you are all right. There's no discrepancy. But as between your clothes and your bearing, you are all wrong. There is a most noticeable discrepancy. Your soldierly stride, your lordly port, these will not do. You stand too straight. Your looks are too high, too confident. The cares of a kingdom do not stoop the shoulders. They do not droop the chin. They do not depress the high level of the eye glance. They do not put doubt and fear in the heart and hang out the sides of them in slouching body and unsure step. It is the sordid cares of the lowly born that do these things. You must learn the trick. You must imitate the trademarks of poverty, misery, oppression, insult, and the other several and common inhumanities that sap the manliness out of a man and make him a loyal and proper and approved subject and a satisfaction to his masters. Or the very infants will know you for better than your disguise, and we shall go to pieces at the first hut we stop at. Pray, try to walk like this. The king took careful note and then tried an imitation. Pretty fair. Pretty fair. Chin a little lower, please. There. Very good. Eyes too high. Pray, don't look at the horizon. Look at the ground. 10 steps in front of you. Ah, that's better. That's very good. Wait, please. No, you betrayed too much vigor, too much decision. You want more of a shamble. Look at me, please. This is what I mean. No, you're getting it. That is the idea. At least sort of approaches it. Yes, that's pretty fair. But there's a great big something wanting. I don't quite know what it is. Please walk 30 yards so that I can get a perspective on the thing. Now then, your head's right, speed's right, shoulders right, eyes right, chin right, gait, carriage, general style right. Everything's right. Yet the fact remains, the aggregate's wrong. The account don't balance. Do it again, please. Now I think I begin to see what it is. Yes, I've struck it. You see, the general spiritlessness is wanting. That's the trouble. It's all amateur. Mechanical details, all right, almost to a hair. Everything about the delusion perfect, except that it don't delude. What, then, must one do to prevail? Let me think. Can't seem to quite get at it. In fact, there isn't anything that can right the matter but practice. It's a good place for it. Roots and stony ground to break up your stately gait, a region not liable to interruption, only one field and one hut in sight, and they're so far away that nobody could see us from here. It would be well to move a little off the road and put the whole day drilling you, sire. After the drill had gone on a little while, I said, Now, sire, imagine that we are at the door of the hut yonder, and the family are before us. Proceed, please. Accost the head of the house. The king unconsciously straightened up like a monument and said with frozen austerity, Varlet, bring a seat and serve to me what cheer you have. Oh, your grace. Oh, that's not well done. In what lacketh it? These people do not call each other varlets. Nay, is that true? Yes, only those above them call them so. Then must I try again? I will call him villain. No, he may be a free man. Ah, so then peradventure I should call him goodman. That would answer, your grace, but it would still be better if you said friend or brother. Brother? To dirt like that? Ah, but we are pretending to be dirt like that too. It is even true, I will say it. Brother, bring a seat, and hitherto what cheer you have withal. Now 'tis right? Not quite, not wholly right. You have asked for one, not us. For one, not both. Food for one, a seat for one. The king looked puzzled. He wasn't a very heavyweight intellectually. His head was an hourglass. It could stow an idea, but it had to do it a grain at a time, not the whole idea at once. Would you have a seat also and sit? If I did not sit, the man would perceive that we were only pretending to be equals and playing the deception pretty poorly too. It is well and truly said, how wonderful is truth, come it in whatsoever unexpected form it may. Yes, he must bring out seats and food for both, and in serving us present not ewer and napkin with more show of respect than the wanton the other. And there is even yet a detail that needs correcting. He must bring nothing outside. We will go in among the dirt, possibly other repulsive things, and take the food with the household and after the fashion of the house, and all on equal terms except the man be of the serf class. And finally, there will be no ewer and no napkin, whether he be serf or free. Please walk again, my liege. There. Oh, it's better. It's the best yet, but not perfect. The shoulders have known no ignobler burden than iron mail, and they will not stoop. Give me, then, the bag. I will learn the spirit to goeth with burdens that have not honor. It is the spirit that stoopeth the shoulders, I ween, and not the weight, for armor is heavy, yet it is a proud burden, and a man standeth straight in it. Nay, but me no bots, offer me no objections. I will have the thing, strap it upon my back. He was complete now, with that knapsack on, and looked as little as like a king as any man I'd ever known. But it was an obstinate pair of shoulders. They could not seem to learn the trick of stooping with any sort of deceptive naturalness. The drill went on. I prompting and correcting. Now, make believe you are in debt and eaten up by relentless creditors. You are out of work, which is horseshoeing, let us say, and can get none, and your wife is sick, your children are crying because they are hungry, and so on and so on. I drilled him as representing in turn all sorts of people out of luck and suffering dire privations and misfortunes. But Lord, it was only just words. They meant nothing in the world to him. I might as well have whistled. Words mean nothing, vivify nothing to you unless you have suffered in your own person the thing which the words try to describe. There are wise people who talk ever so knowingly and complacently about the working classes, and satisfy themselves that a day's hard intellectual work is very much harder than a day's hard manual toil, and is righteously entitled to much bigger pay. Why, they really think that, because they all know about the one but haven't tried the other. But I know all about both. Now, so far as I'm concerned, there isn't money enough in the universe to hire me to swing a pickaxe 30 days, but I will do the hardest kind of intellectual work for just as near nothing as you can cipher it down, and I will be satisfied too. Intellectual work is misnamed. It is a pleasure, a dissipation, and is its own highest reward. The poorest paid architect, engineer, general, author, sculptor, painter, lecturer, advocate, legislator, actor, preacher, singer is constructively in heaven when he is at work. And as for the magician with the fiddle bow in his hand, who sits in the midst of a great orchestra with the ebbing and flowing tides of divine sound washing over him, why, certainly, he is at work, if you wish to call it that, but Lord, it's a sarcasm just the same. The law of work does seem utterly unfair, but there it is. Nothing can change it. The higher the pay and enjoyment the worker gets out of it, the higher shall be his pay in cash, too. And it's also the very law of those transparent swindles, transmissible nobility and kingship. Chapter 29, The Smallpox Hut. When we arrived at that hut by mid-afternoon, we saw no signs of life about it. The field nearby had been denuded of its crop some time before, and had a skinned look, so exhaustively had it been harvested and gleaned. Fences, sheds, everything had a ruined look and were eloquent of poverty. No animal was around anywhere, no living thing in sight. The stillness was awful. It was like the stillness of death. The cabin was a one-story one, whose thatch was black with age and ragged from lack of repair. The door stood a trifle ajar. We approached it stealthily, on tiptoe and at half-breath, for that is the way one's feeling makes him do for such a time. The king knocked. We waited. No answer. Knocked again. No answer. I pushed the door softly open and looked in. I made out some dim forms, and a woman started up from the ground and stared at me, as one does who is wakened from sleep. "Have mercy," she pleaded. "All is taken, nothing is left." "I've not come to take anything, poor woman." "You are not a priest?" "No." "Nor come from the lord of the manor?" "No, I'm a stranger." "Oh, then, for the fear of God, who visits with misery and death such as be harmless, tarry not here, but fly. This place is under his curse and his churches." "Let me come in and help you. You're sick and in trouble." I was better used to the dim night now. I could see her hollow eyes fixed upon me. I could see how emaciated she was. "I tell you the place is under the church's ban. Save yourself, and go before some stragglers see thee here and report it." "Give yourself no trouble about me. I don't care anything for the church's curse. Let me help you." "Now, all good spirits, if there be any such, bless thee for that word. Would God I had a sup of water, but hold, forget I said it, and fly, for there is that here, which even he that feareth not the church must fear, this disease whereof we die. Leave us, thou brave good stranger, and take with thee such whole and sincere blessing as them that be accursed can give." Before this, I had picked up a wooden bowl and was rushing past the king on my way to the brook. It was 10 yards away. When I got back and entered, the king was within and was opening the shutter that closed the window hole to let in air and light. The place was full of a foul stench. I put the bowl to the woman's lips, and as she gripped it with her eager talons, the shutter came open and a strong light flooded her face. "Smallpox." I sprang to the king and said in his ear, "Out of that door on the instant, sire. The woman is dying of that disease that wasted the skirts of Camelot 2 years ago." He did not budge. "Of a truth I shall remain, and likewise help." I whispered again, "King, It must not be, you must go. Ye mean well, and ye speak not unwisely, but it were shame that a king should know fear, and shame that belted knight should withhold his hand where it be such as need succour. Peace, I will not go. It is you that must go. The church's ban is not upon me, but it is forbiddeth you to be here, and she will deal with you with a heavy hand, and word come to her of your trespass. It was a desperate place for him to be, and it might cost him his life, but it was no use to honour with him. If he considered his knightly honour at stake here, that was the end of argument. He would stay, and nothing could prevent it. I was aware of that, and so I dropped the subject. The woman spoke. Fair sir, of your kindness will ye climb the ladder there, and bring me news of what ye find? Be not afraid to report, for times can come when even a mother's heart is past breaking, being already broken. Abide, said the king, and give the woman to eat. I will go. And he put down the knapsack. I turned to start, but the king had already started. He halted and looked down upon a man who lay in a dim light, and had not noticed us thus far or spoken. Is it your husband? The king asked. Yes. Is he asleep? God be thanked for that one charity, yes, these 3 hours. Where shall I pay to the full my gratitude, for my heart is bursting with it for that sleep he sleepeth now. I said, We will be careful. We will not wake him. Ah, no, that ye will not, for he is dead. Dead? Yes, what triumph it is to know it. None can harm him, none insult him more. He is in heaven now, and happy. Or if not there, he bides in hell and is content. For in that place he will find neither abbot nor yet bishop. We were boy and girl together, we were man and wife these 25 years, and never separated till this day. Think how long that is to love and suffer together. This morning was he out of his mind, and in his fancy we were boy and girl again, and wandering in the happy fields. And so in that innocent, glad converse wandered he farther and farther, still lightly gossiping, entered into those other fields we know not of, and was shut away from mortal sight. And so there was no parting, for in his fancy I went with him. He knew not, but I went with him, my hand in his, my young, soft hand, not this withered claw. Ah, yes, to go and know it not, to separate and know it not. How could one go peacefuller than that? It was his reward for a cruel life patiently borne. There was a slight noise from the direction of the dim corner where the ladder was. It was the king descending. I could see that he was bearing something in one arm and assisting himself with the other. He came forward into the light. Upon his breast lay a slender girl of 15. She was but half conscious. She was dying of smallpox. Here was heroism at its last and loftiest possibility, its utmost summit. This was challenging death in the open field unarmed, with all the odds against the challenger, no reward set upon the contest, and no admiring world in silks and cloth of gold to gaze and applaud, and yet the king's bearing was as serenely brave as it had always been in those cheaper contests, where knight meets knight in equal fight and clothed in protecting steel. He was great now, sublimely great. The rude statues of his ancestors in his palace should have an addition. I would see to that, and would not be a mailed king killing a giant or a dragon like the rest. It would be a king in commoner's garb, bearing death in his arms, that a peasant mother might look her last upon her child and be comforted. He laid the girl down by her mother, who poured out endearments and caresses from an overflowing heart, and one could detect a flickering, faint light of response in the child's eyes, but that was all. The mother hung over her, kissing her, petting her, and imploring her to speak, but the lips only moved and no sound came. I snatched my liquor flask from my knapsack, but the woman forbade me and said, No, she does not suffer, it is better so. It might bring her back to life. None that be so good and kind as ye are would do her that cruel hurt. For look you, what is left to live for? Her brothers are gone, her father is gone, her mother goeth, the church's curse is upon her, and none may shelter or befriend her, even though she lay perishing in the road. She is desolate. I have not asked you, good heart, if her sister be still alive and live here overhead. I had no need ye had gone back else, and not let the poor thing forsaken. She lieth at peace, interrupted the king in a subdued voice. I would not change it. How rich is this day in happiness! Ah, my Annis, thou shalt join thy sister soon. Thou art on thy way, and these be merciful friends that will not hinder. And so she fell to murmuring and cooing over the girl again, and softly stroking her hair and face, and kissing her and calling her by endearing names. But there was scarcely sign of response now in the glazing eyes. I saw tears well from the king's eyes and trickle down his face. The woman noticed them too and said, I know that sign. Thou hast a wife at home, poor soul, and you and she have gone hungry to bed many's the time, that the little ones might have your crust. You know what poverty is, and the daily insults of your betters, and the heavy hand of the church and king. The king winced under this accidental home shot, but kept still. He was learning his part, and he was playing it well too, for a pretty dull beginner. I struck up a diversion. I offered the woman food and liquor, but she refused both. She would allow nothing to come between her and the release of death. Then I slipped away and brought the dead child from a loft and laid it by her. This broke her down again, and there was another scene that was full of heartbreak. By and by I made another diversion and beguiled her to sketch her story. Ye know it well yourselves, having suffered it, for truly none of our condition in Britain escape it. It is the old weary tale. We fought and struggled and succeeded, meaning by success that we lived and did not die. More than that is not to be claimed. No troubles came that we could not outlive till this year brought them. Then came they all at once, as one might say, and overwhelmed us. Years ago, the lord of the manor planted certain fruit trees on our farm, in the best part of it, too. A grievous wrong and shame. But it was his right, interrupted the king. None denieth that, indeed, and the law means anything. What is the Lord's is his, and what is mine is his also. Our farm was ours by lease, therefore 'twas likewise his, to do with as he would. Some little time ago, 3 of those trees were found hewn down. Our 3 grown sons ran frightened to report the crime. Well, in his lordship's dungeon there they lie, who saith there shall they lie and rot till they confess. They have not to confess, being innocent. Wherefore there will they remain till they die. You know that right well, I ween. Think how this left us, a man, a woman, and 2 children, together a crop that was planted by so much greater force, yes, and protected night and day from pigeons and prowling animals that be sacred and must not be hurt by any of our sort. When my lord's crop was nearly ready for the harvest, so also was ours. When his bell rang to call us to his fields to harvest his crops for nothing, he would not allow that. I and my 2 girls should count for our 3 captive sons, but for only 2 of them, so for the lacking one were we daily fined. All this time our own crop was perishing through neglect, and so both the priest and his lordship fined us because their shares of it were suffering through damage. In the end, the fines ate up all our crop, and they took it all. They took it all and made us harvest it for them without pay or food, and we starving. And the worst came when I, being out of my mind with hunger and loss of my boys and grief, to see my husband and my little maids in rags and misery and despair, uttered a deep blasphemy, 1,000 of them, against the church and the church's ways. It was 10 days ago. I had fallen sick with this disease, and it was to the priest I said the words, for he was come to chide me for lack of due humility under the chastening hand of God. He carried my trespass to his betters. I was stubborn, wherefore presently upon my head and on heads that were dear to me fell the curse of Rome. Since that day we are avoided, shunned with horror. None has come near this hut to know whether we live or not. The rest of us were taken down. Then I roused me and got up as wife and mother will. It was little they could have eaten in any case. It was less than little they had to eat. But there was water, and I gave them that. How they craved it and how they blessed it. But the end came yesterday. My strength broke down. Yesterday was the last time I ever saw my husband and this youngest child alive. I have lain here all these hours, these ages, ye may say, listening for the sound, any sound up there that... She gave a quick, sharp glance at her eldest daughter, then cried out, "Oh, my darling!" and feebly gathered the stiffening form to her sheltering arms. She had recognized the death rattle. We come to our last chapter of the evening, chapter 30, the tragedy of the manor house. At midnight all was over, and we sat in the presence of 4 corpses. We covered them as such rags as we could find and started away, fastening the door behind us. Their home must be these people's grave, for they could not have Christian burial or be admitted to consecrated ground. They were as dogs, wild beasts, lepers, and no soul that valued its hope of eternal life would throw it away by meddling in any sort with these rebuked and smitten outcasts. We had not moved 4 steps when I caught a sound as of footsteps upon gravel. My heart flew to my throat. We must not be seen coming from that house. I plucked at the king's robe, and we drew back and took shelter behind the corner of the cabin. Now we are safe, I said, but it was a close call, so to speak. If the night had been lighter, he might have seen us, no doubt. He seemed to be so near. Mayhap it is but a beast and not a man at all. True, but man or beast, it would be wise to stay here a minute and let it get by and out of the way. Hark! It cometh hither. True again. The step was coming toward us, straight toward the hut. It must be a beast then, and we might as well have saved our trepidation. I was going to step out, but the king laid his hand upon my arm. There was a moment of silence, and then we heard a soft knock on the cabin door. It made me shiver. Presently the knock was repeated, and then we heard these words in a guarded voice: "Mother! Father! Open, we have got free, and we bring news to pale your cheeks but glad your hearts, and we may not tarry but must fly, and—" But they answer not. "Mother! Father!" I drew the king toward the other end of the hut and whispered, "Come, now we can get to the road." The king hesitated, was going to demur, but just then we heard the door give way, and knew that those desolate men were in the presence of their dead. "Come, my liege, in a moment they will strike a light, and then will follow that which it would break your heart to hear." He did not hesitate this time. The moment we were in the road, I ran, and after a moment he threw dignity aside and followed. I did not want to think of what was happening in the hut. I couldn't bear it. I wanted to drive it out of my mind, so I struck into the first subject that lay under that one in my mind. "I've had that disease those people died of, and so have nothing to fear, but if you have not had it also—" He broke in upon me to say he was in trouble, and it was his conscience that is troubling one. "These young men have got free, they say, but how? It is not likely that their Lord hath set them free." "Oh no, I make no doubt that they escaped." "That is my trouble. I have a fear that this is so, and your suspicion doth confirm it, you having the same fear." "I should not call it by that name, though. I do suspect that they'd escaped, but if they did, I'm not sorry, certainly. I'm not sorry, I think, but what is it? What is it for there one to be troubled about? If they did escape, then are we bound in duty to lay hands upon them and deliver them again to their Lord? For it is not seemly that one of his qualities should suffer so insolent and high-handed outrage from persons of their base degree." There it was again. He could only see one side of it. He was born so, educated so. His veins were full of ancestral blood that was rotten with the sort of unconscious brutality brought down by inheritance from a long procession of hearts that had each done its share toward poisoning the stream. To imprison these men without proof and starve their kindred was no harm, for they were merely peasants and subject to the will and pleasure of their lord, no matter what fearful form it might take. But for these men to break out of unjust captivity was insult and outrage, and a thing not to be countenanced by any conscientious person who knew his duty to his sacred caste. I worked more than half an hour before I got him to change the subject, and even then an outside matter did it for me. This was something which caught our eyes as we struck the summit of a small hill, a red glow a good way off. "That's a fire," said I. Fires interest me considerably because I was getting a good deal of an insurance business started and was also training some horses and building some steam fire engines, with an eye toward a paid fire department by and by. The priest opposed both my fire and life insurance on the ground that it was an insolent attempt to hinder the decrees of God, and if he pointed out that they did not hinder the decrees in the least, but only modified the hard consequences of them if you took out policies and had luck, they retorted that it was gambling against the decrees of God and was just as bad. So they managed to damage those industries more or less, but I got even on my accident business. As a rule, a knight is a lummox, and sometimes even a labrick, and hence open to pretty poor arguments when they come glibly from a superstition monger. But even he could see the practical side of a thing once in a while, and so of late you couldn't clean up a tournament and pile the result without finding out my accident tickets in every helmet. We stood there a while in the thick darkness and stillness, looking toward the red blur in the distance, and trying to make out the meaning of a faraway murmur that rose and fell fitfully on the night. Sometimes it swelled up and for a moment seemed less remote, but when we were hopefully expecting it to betray its cause and nature, it dulled and sank again, carrying its mystery with it. We started down the hill in its direction, and the winding road plucked us at once into almost solid darkness that was packed and crammed in between two tall forest walls. We groped down for half a mile, perhaps, that murmur growing more and more distinct all the time, the coming storm threatening more and more, with now and then a little shiver of wind, a faint show of lightning, and dull grumblings of distant thunder. I was in the lead. I ran against something, a soft, heavy something which gave slightly to the impulse of my weight. At the same moment, the lightning glared out, and within a foot of my face was the writhing face of a man who was hanging from the limb of a tree. That is, it seemed to be writhing, but it was not. It was a gruesome sight. Straight away, there was an ear-splitting explosion of thunder, and the bottom of heaven fell out. The rain poured down in a deluge. No matter, we must try to cut this man down on the chance that there might be life in him yet, mustn't we? The lightning came quick and sharp now, and the place was alternately noonday and midnight. One moment the man would be hanging before me in an intense light, and the next he was blotted out again in the darkness. I told the king we must cut him down. The king at once objected. If he hanged himself, he was willing to lose his property to his lord, and so let him be. If others hanged him, belike they had the right, let him hang. But me no buts, but even leave him as he is, and for another reason. When the lightning cometh again, there, look abroad. 2 others hanging, within 50 yards of us. It is not weather meet for doing useless courtesies unto dead folk. They are past thanking you. Come, it is unprofitable to tarry here. There was reason in what he said, so we moved on. Within the next mile we counted 6 more hanging forms by the blaze of the lightning, and altogether it was a grisly excursion. That murmur was a murmur no longer. It was a roar of men's voices. A man came flying by now, dimly through the darkness, and other men chasing him. They disappeared. Presently another case of the kind occurred, and then another, and another. And then a sudden turn of the road brought us in sight of that fire. It was a large manor house, and little or nothing was left of it, and everywhere men were flying and other men raging after them in pursuit. I warned the king that this was not a safe place for strangers. We would better get away from the light till matters should improve. We stepped back a little and hid in the edge of the wood. From this hiding place we saw both men and women be hunted by the mob. The fearful work went on till nearly dawn. Then, the fire being out and the storm spent, the voices and flying footsteps presently ceased, and darkness and stillness reigned again. We ventured out and hurried cautiously away, and although we were worn out and sleepy, we kept on until we had put this place some miles behind us. Then we asked hospitality at the hut of a charcoal burner, and got what was to be had. A woman was up and about, but the man was still asleep, on a straw shakedown on the clay floor. The woman seemed uneasy until I explained that we were travelers and had lost our way and been wandering in the woods all night. She became talkative then and asked if we had heard of the terrible goings-on at the manor house of Ablasor. Yes, we had heard of them, but what we wanted now was rest and sleep. The king broke in. Sell us the house and take yourselves away, for we be perilous company, being but late come from people that died of the spotted death. It was good of him, but unnecessary. One of the commonest decorations of the nation was the waffle iron face. I had early noticed that the woman and her husband were both so decorated. She made us entirely welcome and had no fears, and plainly she was immensely impressed by the king's proposition. For of course it was a good deal of an event in her life to run across a person of the king's humble appearance, who was ready to buy a man's house for the sake of a night's lodging. It gave her a large respect for us, and she strained the lean possibilities of her hovel to their utmost to make us comfortable. We slept till far into the afternoon, and then got up hungry enough to make cotter fare quite palatable to the king, the more particularly as it was scant in quantity, and also in variety. It consisted solely of onions, salt, and the national black bread, made out of horse feed. The woman told us about the affair of the evening before. At 10 or 11 at night, when everybody was in bed, the manor house burst into flames. The countryside swarmed to the rescue, and the family were saved, with one exception, the master. He did not appear. Everybody was frantic over this loss, and 2 brave yeomen sacrificed their lives in ransacking the burning house seeking that valuable personage. But after a while he was found, what was left of him, which was his corpse. It was in a copse 300 yards away, bound, gagged, stabbed in a dozen places. Who had done this? Suspicion fell upon a humble family in the neighborhood who had been lately treated with peculiar harshness by the baron, and from these people the suspicion easily extended itself to their relatives and familiars. A suspicion was enough. My lord's liveried retainers proclaimed an instant crusade against these people, and were promptly joined by the community in general. The woman's husband had been active with the mob, and had not returned home until nearly dawn. He was gone now to find out what the general result had been. While we were still talking, he came back from his quest. His report was revolting enough. 18 persons hanged or butchered, and 2 yeomen and 13 prisoners lost in the fire. And how many prisoners were there altogether in the vaults? 13. Then every one of them was lost. Yes, all. But the people arrived in time to save the family. How is it they could save none of the prisoners? The man looked puzzled and said, Would one unlock the vaults at such a time? Marry, some would have escaped. Then you mean that nobody did unlock them? Nobody went near them either to lock or unlock. It standeth to reason that the bolts were fast, wherefore it was only needful to establish a watch, so that if any broke the bonds, he might not escape, but be taken. None were taken. Natheless 3 did escape, said the king, and ye will do well to publish it and set justice upon their track, for these murdereth the baron and fired the house. I was just expecting he would come out with that. For a moment the man and his wife showed an eager interest in this news and an impatience to go out and spread it. Then something else betrayed itself in their faces, and They began to ask questions. I answered the questions myself and narrowly watched the effects produced. I was soon satisfied that the knowledge of who these 3 prisoners were had somehow changed the atmosphere, that our host's continued eagerness to go and spread the news was now only pretended and not real. The king did not notice the change, and I was glad of that. I worked the conversation around toward other details of the night's proceedings, and noted that these people were relieved to have it take that direction. The painful thing observable about all this business was the alacrity with which this oppressed community had turned their cruel hands against their own class in the interest of the common oppressor. This man and woman seemed to feel that in a quarrel between a person of their own class and his lord, it was a natural and proper and rightful thing for that poor devil's whole caste to side with the master and fight his battle for him, without ever stopping to inquire into the rights or wrongs of the matter. This man had been out helping to hang his neighbors, and had done his work with zeal, and yet was aware that there was nothing against them but a mere suspicion, with nothing back of it describable as evidence. Still, neither he nor his wife seemed to see anything horrible about it. This was depressing to a man with the dream of a republic in his head. It reminded me of a time 13 centuries away, when the poor whites of our South, who were always despised and frequently insulted by the slave lords around them, and who owned their base conditions simply to the presence of slavery in their midst, were yet pusillanimously ready to side with slave lords in all political moves for the upholding and perpetuating of slavery, and did also finally shoulder their muskets and pour out their lives in an effort to prevent the destruction of that very institution that degraded them. And there was only one redeeming feature connected with that pitiful piece of history, and that was that secretly the poor white did detest the slave lord and did feel his own shame. That feeling was not brought to the surface, but the fact that it was there and could have been brought out under favoring circumstances was something. In fact, it was enough, for it showed that a man is at bottom a man, after all, even if it doesn't show on the outside. Well, as it turned out, this charcoal burner was just the twin of the southern poor white of the far future. The king presently showed impatience and said, "An ye prattle here all the day, justice will miscarry. Think ye the criminals will abide in their father's house? They are fleeing, they are not waiting. You should look to it that a party of horse be set upon their track." The woman paled slightly, but quite perceptibly, and the man looked flustered and irresolute. I said, "Come, friend, I will walk a little way with you and explain which direction I think they would try to take. If they were merely resistors of the gabble or some kindred absurdity, I would try to protect them from capture. But when men murder a person of high degree and likewise burn his house, that is another matter." That last remark was for the king, to quiet him. On the road, the man pulled his resolution together and began the march with a steady gait, but there was no eagerness in it. By and by I said, "What relation were these men to you? Cousins?" He turned as white as his layer of charcoal would let him and stopped, trembling. "Ah, my God, how knew you that?" "I didn't know it. It was a chance guess." "Poor lads, they are lost, and good lads they were too. Were you actually going yonder to tell on them?" He didn't quite know how to take that, but he said, hesitatingly, "Yes." "Then I think you are a damned scoundrel." It made him as glad as if I had called him an angel. "Say ye the good words again, brother, for surely ye mean that ye will not betray me and I failed of my duty." "Duty? There's no duty in the matter, except the duty to keep still and let those men get away. They've done a righteous deed." He looked pleased and touched with apprehension at the same time. He looked up and down the road to see that no one was coming, and then said in a cautious voice, "From what land come you, brother, that you speak such perilous words and seem not afraid?" "They're not perilous words when spoken to one of my own caste, I take it. You would not tell anybody I said them?" "I would be drawn asunder by wild horses first." Then, let me say my say. I have no fears for you repeating it. I think devil's work has been done last night upon those innocent poor people. That old baron only got what he deserved. If I had my way, all of his kind should have the same luck. Fear and depression vanished from the man's manner, and gratefulness and a brave animation took their place. "Even though you be a spy, and your words a trap for my undoing, yet they are such refreshment, that to hear them again and others like to them, I would go to the gallows happy, as having had one good feast at least in a starved life. And I will say my say now, and ye may report it if ye be so minded. I helped to hang my neighbors for that it were peril to my own life to show lack of zeal in the master's cause. The others helped for none other reason. All rejoice today that he is dead, but all do go about seemingly sorrowing and shedding the hypocrite's tear, for in that lies safety. I have said the words, and for the only ones that have ever tasted good in my mouth, and the reward of that taste is sufficient. Lead on, and ye will, be it even to the scaffold, for I am ready." There it was, you see. A man is a man at bottom. Whole ages of abuse and oppression cannot crush the manhood clear out of him. Whoever thinks it is a mistake is himself mistaken. Yes, there's plenty good enough material for a republic in the most degraded people that ever existed. Even the Russians, plenty of manhood in them, even in the Germans, if one could but force it out of its timid and suspicious privacy, to overthrow and trample in the mud any throne that ever was set up and any nobility that ever supported it. We should see certain things yet, let us hope and believe. First, a modified monarchy. Nobility abolished, every member of it bound out to some useful trade, universal suffrage instituted, and the whole government placed in the hands of the men and women of the nation there to remain. Yes, there was no occasion to give up my dream yet a while. And that is where I shall leave you for this week. Next time we meet will be in 2 weeks on Thursday, June the 9th. We'll be in the month of June, and we will be on our next to last reading of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. So, in the meantime, keep reading. Keep wearing your fabulous wizard's hat. Keep thinking up your wizard names. What would your name be? And be sure to join us again in 2 weeks' time, right here on YouTube on June the 9th at 7 p.m. Have a good night.